Hi and welcome, or welcome back. Last week I talked about the bogus defenses that Trump Organization defenders offered in the media after the Trump Organization was indicted. This week's talk will build on last week's, so if you missed last week's, you might want to watch that one first, but you don't have to. If you don't, the go-in-order police won't come knocking at your door. In a nutshell, the indictment alleges that the Trump Organization and its chief financial officer, Allen Weisselberg, ran a 15-year systematic ongoing tax fraud scheme. As part of the scheme, Weisselberg and other Trump Organization executives allegedly received substantial portions of their salaries under the table. The indictment listed 15 counts of tax fraud and falsification of documents. It's easy to mock the stupid legal arguments and bogus defenses offered by Team Trump. Trump usually loses in court. He lost all those elections cases. But he manages to win in the court of right-wing public opinion, and that's part of what makes him dangerous. What I'm going to do today is show you how Trump defenders are spinning the indictment and why it matters. As always, the best example of how Trump defenders are spinning and propagandizing is from Trump himself. About a week ago, Trump gave a talk. We'll look closely at the spin, and then I'll talk about why it matters. He said this: "People are afraid to go into our Democrat-run cities, and yet they refers to prosecutors, go after good, hard-working people for failing to pay taxes on a company car." A company car. You didn't pay taxes on the car. First, notice the reference to Democrat-run cities. This is a standard divisive tactic. This isn't about the Trump Organization versus law enforcement. It's about Republicans versus Democrats. He says you didn't. He wants us to be us versus them. He wants his followers to feel that they too are being prosecuted. The indictment actually says this: from at least 2005 through 2017, and as part of the scheme to defraud, the Trump Corporation paid the annual lease expenses on 2 Mercedes-Benz automobiles that were the personal cars of Weisselberg and his wife. There's obviously a big difference between driving a company car and the company picking up the tab for your personal cars. Not only was it not a company car, it was 2 personal cars, one for Weisselberg and one for his wife. Now, his supporters at that rally might identify with driving a company car, and they could think it would be unfair to be prosecuted for not paying the taxes on a company car. But the reality is that Weisselberg and his wife each got a personal Mercedes-Benz paid under the table in a way that allowed both sides to cheat. Not too many people identify with a free Mercedes-Benz for all those years for you and your wife. Now, Trump went on to say, you didn't pay the tax on the car. Again, you didn't pay the tax on the car, as if his followers are right there with him. Trump said, you didn't pay the tax on the car or the company apartment. Now, regarding the apartment, the indictment alleged that, beginning on or about March 31st, 2005, the Trump Organization maintained a lease for a Manhattan apartment. From the beginning of the lease through June 30th, 2021, the sole residents of the apartment have been Weisselberg and his spouse, and Weisselberg maintained the apartment as his permanent place of abode. Now, here's what Trump had to say about this. You used an apartment because you need an apartment because you have to travel too far where your house is, and you didn't pay the tax. Now again, there's obviously a big difference between staying occasionally in a company apartment after working late, and living rent-free in Manhattan for more than 15 years. Now, moreover, Weisselberg lied and said he didn't live in New York, so he also avoided New York taxes. He got a free apartment all those years, his permanent place of living, but he didn't pay the tax. Now, Trump spun things this way. But they indict people for that. But for murder and selling massive amounts of the worst drugs in the world that kill people left and right, that's okay. Think how unfair it is. Never before has New York City and their prosecutors, and perhaps any prosecutors, criminally charged a company for fringe benefits. Now, this is what Trump said. Nobody was indicted for fringe benefits. First of all, those weren't fringe benefits. And second, the charge was for tax fraud and falsifying documents. Now, it's been said about this speech, in fact, the media take on this speech was that Trump appeared to admit the allegations. In fact, Trump didn't admit to the crimes alleged against the companies. He mischaracterized the crimes as something they were not and then seemed to admit to those. It's like being charged with stealing $1,000 from a bank vault and admitting to picking up a few dollars from a counter on your way out, and then arguing that picking up a few dollars is no big deal. An admission would have been something like, yes, for years we paid a substantial part of our executive salaries under the table. Now, notice this phrase. I don't even know. Do they have to pay? Does anybody know the answer to that stuff? It's been suggested that in that particular sentence, Trump was offering what's known as a mens rea defense. What makes criminal cases hard to prove is that in almost every instance, there are a few exceptions, the prosecutor has the burden of proof beyond a reasonable doubt to show that the defendant had criminal intent. Different crimes require different levels of knowledge or intent. As everyone knows who saw Legally Blonde, the intention or knowledge that constitutes a crime is known as mens rea. But Trump wasn't actually offering a defense because he mischaracterized the crime. A person accused of robbing a bank vault is not offering a defense if he says, I didn't know it was wrong to pick up a few dollars that were sitting there on the counter. Does anybody know if that was wrong? Moreover, it would be hard for Trump to pretend ignorance of the tax code after bragging about how cleverly he manipulates it. He claimed in the 2016 debate with Hillary Clinton that not paying taxes made him smart. He also bragged that I have legally used the tax laws to my benefit and the benefit of my company, my investors, and my employees. I mean, honestly, I have brilliantly used those laws. I don't think that Trump was offering a defense here. I think he was trying to hoodwink his supporters into thinking that the charges were something that they're not. Now, Trump wasn't the only one that gave this particular spin. The question is, was it successful? Well, one poll showed that 51% of voters think that the prosecution of the Trump organization was political. It's only one poll, and we're early in the process, but I want to talk about why the court of right-wing opinion matters. Let's divide the right wing into three groups. The first group is what we might call the elites. These are the elected senators, governors, and party leaders. Another group are the hardcore Trump supporters. Think of these guys, or the evangelical Christians who want to live in a theocracy. They don't care if Trump lies or cheats or steals because they like what he's trying to do. Some of this group actually like lawbreakers, like these guys. Can you imagine them saying, Trump is in trouble with the law, so let's all learn to play nice? In fact, there's a myth out there on Twitter, and I assume elsewhere, that the reason people like Trump commit crimes is because they don't face consequences. The implication is if they do face consequences, they'll stop committing crimes. I say baloney. Hitler was in prison and then went on to become chancellor, where of course he committed unspeakable crimes. Anyone who voted for Trump in 2020 had enough evidence that Trump was a lawbreaker, but they didn't care. How people feel about their leaders being in jail or being indicted often depends on how they feel about the underlying crimes. That's why Trump's spin is so important. Think of Martin Luther King Jr. in jail, or Rosa Parks getting arrested. Henry David Thoreau was in jail, actually, for not paying a tax. He didn't pay the tax to protest slavery and what he called America's imperialistic war against Mexico. Was he wrong? I don't think so. So while it's important for Trump to face criminal consequences for lawbreaking, and I believe he will, that alone will not cause Trump to say, I better stop criming. It will not make the Trump wannabes say, we better not break any laws. But if Trump starts losing in the court of right-wing public opinion, that might doom him. I mentioned dividing the Republican Party into three groups. The first group are the elites, the second group, the hardcore extremists, who literally wouldn't care if Trump shot someone on Fifth Avenue. There's a third group, which I think is relatively small, which are people who have always identified with being Republican and can't yet let go, but something might push them. I think it's worth noting that you shouldn't bother trying to persuade them. You'll feel like you're knocking your head against the wall. But there was a drop in Republican registration after the January 6th insurrection as people changed their registration, presumably from Republican to independent. So there may still be a few persuadable people. But the bigger question is what will cause the elites to stop propping Trump up? There's a split of opinion out there over whether there will be more indictments against the Trump Organization executives. I'm in the group who thinks there will be for reasons I explained last week. I also think there's a difference between a rich man cheating, which is what it looks like right now to his supporters, and a crook who has wealth only because he cheats. There's a difference between driving a company car and getting a free Mercedes-Benz for you and a free Mercedes-Benz for your wife. Depending on what comes out, it may get harder for Trump to spin the indictments. A few weeks ago, in a video called Strong Men, I talked about Ruth Ben-Ghiat's book. She says that strong men fall when the conservative elites stop propping them up. The Republican elites will stop propping Trump up when it's in their best interest to stop. If and when they do stop propping him up, the Republican Party will splinter because there are not enough of these guys for them to win elections. Trump's value to the party is that before 2016, a lot of these guys didn't vote. Now they're enthusiastic voters. If they stay home, the Republican Party will have a hard time winning elections because nationally, the Republican Party is a minority party with unpopular economic policies. Daniel Ziblatt, one of the co-authors of this book, talks about what he calls the conservative dilemma, which goes like this. How can conservatives win national elections with unpopular economic policies? We can see the way right-wing America is doing it, by stirring up culture wars so that their supporters don't think about or notice or care that Republican economic policies hurt them. The reason people like Lindsey Graham did an about-face about Trump, initially saying, if we nominate Trump, we will get destroyed and we will deserve it, and then now saying the GOP can't move forward without Trump, is because he sees that Trump turns out voters. In particular, he turns out these voters, and without them, the Republican Party now sees no path forward. Initially, when he said, if we nominate Trump, we will get destroyed, he didn't understand how motivating a force Trump would be for getting a radicalized segment of the population to the polls. Trump has also taught the Republican Party how to perfect the art of disinformation. He lies shamelessly and gets away with it. They find him freeing. I often say that there's no easy fix to our political problems, but one fairly easy fix would be if something comes out in the new indictments that Trump is no longer able to spin in the court of right-wing public opinion. Because if that happens and the elites find they can no longer prop him up without other party members fleeing, the Republican Party will fracture. Well, that's all for this week. Thank you for joining me. You can also find me on Twitter, and I'll see you next week.